Now that you know how the air gets into the lung itself, we're going to talk about how the oxygen from that air gets into the bloodstream and how the CO2 gets out. And all of this happens here at the alveoli. So I'm coming to you from the alveolus, and I want you to notice a couple things. One is that there's a hole over here. What's going to come through that hole? That's where the air is coming through the bronchus and into that alveolus. You're also going to notice that there is a huge layer of goo. And what that goo is it's something called surfactant. And surfactant's really important to those alveoli because it keeps them from sticking together if they ever collapse. This is because of surface tension, which is the same reason why it's really hard to get your hand in a wet glove. In addition, you're going to notice two cell types in this alveoli. One of those is a cell which creates the surfactant. The other one is a macrophage. And what those macrophages are going to do is they're going to gobble up any crud that happens to get into this alveolus. When we look at the air molecules moving around within this alveolus, we're going to notice something. The air that you breathe is higher in oxygen than your blood. And so what's going to happen is once that air reaches the alveolus, it is going to go from high concentration to low concentration. Because remember, everybody likes to go down the slide. We don't like to go up the stairs. So that oxygen is going to go down its concentration gradient into the blood. Then the carbon dioxide in your blood, which is higher, because basically what's been going on is your cells have been active, is that they have been pooping. And your cells' poop is carbon dioxide. That carbon dioxide builds up in your blood, and it's higher in your blood than it is in the air outside. So that carbon dioxide is going to go down its concentration gradient, which causes it to go out of that alveolus. Gases are a little bit different than liquids when we think about how much there is in something. If you can imagine me bringing a coffee cup of gas into the classroom, the gases would go out of this coffee cup. They wouldn't be in there. So there's no going to your neighbor and asking for a cup of gas. Gases are compressible. So instead of measuring them by a volume, like a cup or a liter, we measure gases by their pressure. So we use something called Dalton's law to describe this. And what that means is that we're looking at the pressure of gases, and they're going from their high pressure to low pressure. This is basically concentration, and that's how I want you to think about it for this portion. Now that's all going on in the lung, but that's not the only place where we have to deal with these gases. Remember that your cells are using oxygen to make ATP. And basically what's happening is we need to carry that oxygen to those cells. And then those cells are going to be active and they're going to release that carbon dioxide, which is their waste product. And we want to get that carbon dioxide away from those cells. So let's look at what happens in the tissues and how those concentration gradients are different in your tissues than they are in your lung. So let's think about what these gas concentrations would look like. Well, in your lung, what's going to happen is that fresh air from outside is going to have a higher oxygen content than your blood. And what that's going to do is make that oxygen move into your blood. The carbon dioxide at your lung is in higher concentration than the carbon dioxide out. So that's going to cause the carbon dioxide to move out. When we go to the tissues, we get a slightly different story. What's going to happen is your cells in your tissues have really low oxygen in them because they've been using all that oxygen to make ATP. So the oxygen from your blood is in higher concentration than the oxygen in the cells. That means that oxygen is going to move into those cells. Those cells have been creating carbon dioxide as a byproduct of their cell respiration, which is the creation of that ATP. So CO2 is going to be in higher concentration inside those cells than it will be in the blood. And that means the CO2 moves out into the blood. Now there's an issue here, and that's that oxygen is not that soluble. That means it has a hard time moving through water. And what's blood? It's mostly water. So what we need to figure out a different way to carry that oxygen. And this comes in the form of a molecule called hemoglobin. Every hemoglobin molecule can hold 4 oxygens. And the hemoglobin will grab onto those oxygens and carry them through the blood. The concentration gradients have an interesting impact on hemoglobin's ability to bind. So let's think of the hemoglobin. The hemoglobin at the lung is going to be grabbing onto oxygens. What this means is it's going to be shifting from an unbound state to its bound state, and this is going to follow something called the law of mass action. Basically, what's going to happen is we're going to try to shift the hemoglobin to reach an equilibrium. If we have more of one state than the other, we're going to shift it towards that state. At the lung, we have mostly unbound hemoglobin. That unbound hemoglobin is going to be driven to bind oxygen. As it's binding oxygen, it's going to move to the tissues. When we reach the tissues, all the hemoglobins are bound to oxygens, which means that now the law of mass action is going to shift the opposite direction, and it's going to have those hemoglobins drop their oxygen. As those oxygens get sucked into the cells, that means that the reaction is going to be shifted even more to make more oxygen free. It is important to remember that hemoglobin is a protein and that certain environmental factors can affect the shape of proteins. In the case of hemoglobin, this gives it a couple more interesting traits. One of those traits is that every time an oxygen binds, it makes that hemoglobin more likely to bind oxygen until it gets all 4 of its oxygen binding sites bound. This is called cooperative binding. And the cool thing about cooperative binding is it means pretty much once you've got 1 or 2 oxygens bound, that hemoglobin has such an easy time grabbing oxygen that you are going to saturate that hemoglobin with 4 oxygens pretty shortly thereafter. There are other factors that affect the ability of hemoglobin to bind oxygen. One of those is temperature. Hemoglobin loves to bind in cooler environments. And when you are exhaling, you're not just losing carbon dioxide, you're also losing heat. What this means is that that alveolar epithelia is cooler than the rest of your body. That makes it more likely to bind oxygen at that point. When we go to your muscles, one of the consequences of cleaving ATP to make those muscle contractions is the creation of heat. In your muscles, that hemoglobin is going to get warm, and that makes it more likely to drop oxygen. Well, this is great for those muscle cells that want to suck up that oxygen, so they need the hemoglobin to drop it. In addition, pH influences the ability of hemoglobin to bind, and it turns out that when you've got a high amount of carbon dioxide, also because of that law of mass action, you end up creating a higher amount of acid. So any tissue that's creating a lot of carbon dioxide is going to be acidic, and any tissue that's losing a lot of carbon dioxide is going to be basic. What this means is in your lung, in the alveolus, it is a basic environment. This is going to make the hemoglobin have an easier time to bind oxygen. When we get to the tissues, now there's a CO2 buildup, and that's going to translate to an acidic environment, which is going to make the hemoglobin have an easier time dropping the oxygen. Now, this can cause problems in terms of health. If you have issues maintaining your body pH within normal homeostatic levels, and you end up a little bit more acidic, this means your body is going to have a harder time getting that oxygen from your lung epithelium to your tissues. And this is called acidosis, and it is actually one of the leading causes of death. And it happens when your kidneys and your respiratory system fail to regulate pH. You might wonder how your respiratory system regulates pH. Well, the more you exhale, the more of that acid you're going to get rid of. So if you start to hyperventilate, you're getting rid of a lot of CO2, and that's going to cause your pH to increase or get more basic. If you are breathing much slower, you're getting rid of less CO2, which is going to translate to you being more acidic. So let's take a minute and think about being in the mountains. In the mountains, the overall pressure of air is lower, the atmospheric pressure. It's lower because you're at a higher altitude. That means that the partial pressure of oxygen or concentration of oxygen is lower in the air. That's going to affect how that oxygen gets into your bloodstream. Basically, it's going to have a less steep gradient, so it's going to be harder for it to go down the gradient and get into your bloodstream. So, what do? When you're at high altitude for a longer period of time, your body secretes a hormone called erythropoietin, And that hormone makes more red blood cells. More red blood cells means more hemoglobin. And more hemoglobin means we are increasing that tendency for hemoglobin to bind oxygen because we have more unbound hemoglobin, and that's going to drive that law of mass action. What some elite athletes have done when they're cheating is that they have injected erythropoietin. And when you inject erythropoietin, that artificially creates more red blood cells. Well, there's a downside to that. When you've got more red blood cells, your blood is thicker, which means you have a greater chance of getting clots.